All right, I think people have time to connect. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I'm Mark Privot, and on behalf of the GALA Programs Committee, welcome to this session of the second day of the GALA Conference, The Future of Speech Data. So let me start by reminding you that we'll have time to answer questions at the end of the discussion. So don't forget to use the button on your control panel. It's marked Q&A. And also don't forget to vote for your favorite. With me today, we are joined by Shannon Zimmerman, who will be leading this panel discussion. Shannon is an investor and serves as the Chief Revenue Officer for Summa Linguae Technologies. He brings 25 years of experience in global content-related technology and service business leadership to the company. From startup to NASDAQ CEO, Shannon has been an aggressive visionary that puts the unique needs of the consumer first. At Summa Linguae Technologies, the blend of multilingual content and advanced forms of data collections for AI represent a substantial market opportunity for all involved. Together, the team is assisting companies around the world realize the benefits of AI. Okay, so without further ado, Shannon, the floor is yours.
Mark, thank you very much for the introduction, and for all those attending and who may watch this online. We sincerely appreciate the opportunity to share what I think will be some pretty interesting information for those as we kind of excitingly move through the evolution of this industry. Before I get started, I'd like to just take a very quick moment to introduce a couple of my colleagues who will be participating and who are the subject matter experts today. So Brian, I'll turn it to you to introduce yourself, and then on to Rick, and then I'll begin.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Hi, I'm Brian Sonnet, and want to thank everyone for attending this session. I am the managing director for the data solutions team, which is comprised of both operations and development/engineering, and very happy to be here. I have about 20 years of experience in localization, and several of those years have also been in the AI sector. And so let me turn it to Rick.
Hey, everybody. I'm Rick, and I've been with the company for about 5 years now. And it's a very interesting field, and I'm very excited to talk to you all about it.
Well, excellent. Thanks, Rick. So Brian, I'll kind of guide us through the slides, but you can just hold for 1 second. So maybe just as a little bit of grounding on the start of today's presentation, for myself, who has spent, nearly 25, dating myself now, maybe 25 years in localization, globalization, and all associated technologies, this emerging market, this rapidly growing market of AI and certainly data collection for AI is astounding, really, in so many ways. And there's a lot of market factors that are driving this. So I don't want to assume for today's call that everybody has a deep knowledge in this. So I'm going to be a little bit lay a little bit of a foundation, I guess, as we get started, so that people have the same starting point. But essentially, if you think back on localization and how it kind of evolved, people needed to communicate with one another, and naturally language was an obvious barrier. And so a wide variety of solutions emerged, and that industry would grow and change and all kinds of great things. And then you started to see the emergence of new technologies, new smartphones, new ways that we would interact with one another. And so that immediately kind of challenged the status quo and the traditional way that people exchanged information. So Brian, you can go to the next slide if you would, please.
Okay.
And so when you think about, all the different ways that people are connected these days, so, you take just even a smart speaker, right? It's estimated right now that in the US, 90 million plus people have these sort of devices. These devices are many times, if not all times, activated through voice commands. And so for the technology, for the product's ability to be able to execute that command, they have to understand what the individual is saying. And we don't all say things the same way. And so you would see a natural kind of this birth, if you will, of an industry, data collection. And specifically here, we're going to talk about speech data today. Brian, you can continue the next slide, please. In addition to the smart speakers and those types of devices that may naturally become obvious, I mean, just think about all the voice assistants, Siri and Alexa, and our automobiles. Recently, my wife and I were in the market for a new refrigerator, and we found that even refrigerators are now voice activated, and you can issue a command. So there's probably no end really to the multitude of different types of devices that that we may encounter and experience. And this affects both businesses and it affects, consumers. Everybody's participating, in certainly in this industry now, whether you know it or you don't. And the important part here, and I'm going to speak a little bit more to it here in a moment, that AI is this wonderful dream of an improved, automated, smarter, more sophisticated tomorrow. And it really is being realized. But AI, if it does not have quality data to train itself, to build itself on, its flaws are going to become obvious, right? So that's a big part of the theme for today. Brian, you can advance to the next slide. So thinking about it, whether you are a potential buyer, user of AI and speech collection for AI, or maybe we have people on this call today, kind of not unlike myself, who grew up in an industry now that seems to be aligned fairly well to this new one. But it's a sizable opportunity, or could be a sizable expense or investment for your company. I mean, data for AI market, is estimated at $3.5 billion. Not a trivial market. And in addition to that, its growth rate is quite substantial over the coming years. So Brian, go to the next slide. I'm going to kind of maybe just take a moment to explain exactly kind of how this occurs for people here. So as we think about again the data that's required to serve AI, the data by itself can be one component, but in addition, we also need to make sure we're likely providing annotations or metadata to some of the speech data that we would collect. The combination of these things really help us improve the quality and usability of that data for AI. Go ahead, Brian. And then I'll just have you go right to the next slide. All right, so let me just take a quick walk before we get into some of the challenges and opportunities and hear more at what I would call a case study sort of format from Brian and from Rick, who are intimately familiar, with much of the content we're talking about. So if you think about how this started, right, in the beginning phases of data collection or speech collection for artificial intelligence, we had a lot of native English speakers, and many of these products may have been initially developed in the United States, other areas, but it was a little bit more simplistic in design. We would split and categorize by maybe gender or age. These create variables, obviously, in the speech data itself. I mean, male voices are different than female, etc. So these are all unique characteristics that can make the data more or less effective. Many times the collections were very scripted. And that still happens today, but nowadays you're finding speech collections that span far beyond just scripted data. You're having regular conversations being recorded so that we can use that information to more effectively train our AI engines. And again, much of it was in studio. Then it started to move. Demands rose, complexities enhanced. We added language, additional language and dialects. We have background noises. So imagine if you're talking to your smartphone and you're in a crowded, busy street, there's all kinds of sounds and background noises that we want AI to hear. We want AI not just to hear your voice in a naked form, but instead hear it in the context of all the other real life things that are going on around it. So, that coupled with sophistication of our microphones and devices, the game just ratcheted up, if you will. So you can go to the final slide before I turn it to you. So that's kind of where we've been. And now let me just move into where we're headed here. We expect more and more. Number one, I can tell you firsthand as a person who has thoroughly gotten excited as we've become more immersed in all forms of AI and data collection. It's growing rapidly, and so too are the complexities and the demands within the space. So unique demographics continue to create new challenges. Second language accents, right? So you can have people who have a native tongue from the country they were born, and now they've, let's just say, moved to Germany or the US or to Japan. And their speech, the dialect will be subtly different over a series of years. the data needs to reflect that, so AI can properly reflect that and certainly incorporate that into the things that we're doing there. Also, remote collections, on-prem connect collections. These aren't just studio collections anymore. More and more AI builders, AI trainers are expecting their providers collect in the field, collect where these things are really, really happening. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues now, who are going to take a little time to go through some specific examples that hopefully are valuable to all those in attendance today. So Brian, back to you, sir.
Thanks, Shannon. Before we go ahead and discuss the challenges and solutions, Allison, were you going to run the polls for us? I see the red light, so cool. We just want to get a feel for the audience that we have today in terms of your knowledge and experience in the areas. Okay, so the numbers are ratcheting up, and looks like the vast majority of people are in the localization translation field, which makes sense. And we'll just give a couple more minutes for people to respond. For those people like myself, where I'm working in AI, I also have worked in localization. So I kind of, could answer that two ways, but I selected AI myself. But it will be interesting to look at this poll a few years from now, when probably it's going to be skewed more towards the AI and voice technology. Let's give it just one more minute. Okay, I think the other people that haven't responded yet are probably just a bit shy. So as you can see, we have triple the number of response. We got a couple more, one more for AI. So, but the large majority of people are working in the localization translation sectors. But again, like I said, in a few years from now, probably these numbers will skew more towards AI. Or at least should match what the people are responding that they work in the localization field. Okay, and so I think we can move on. Allison, we had a second poll, I believe. Alrighty. Again, we're just trying to get a pulse on the audience today to see what their knowledge is for this second question, and how familiar you are with speech technology development. Haven't seen anyone yet bold enough to respond with a 4 or 5 in this poll, but hoping maybe there will be a couple on here that are experts. Okay. So the vast majority of people are anywhere from 0 to, say, in the middle in terms of, which is great because this is supposed to be an educational type of presentation. And by introducing you to the challenges, which we'll do in a moment, then you can appreciate the kinds of things we're running into. And if you haven't hit those challenges yet, you probably will in the near future. Okay, this time we had a few more votes. So again, everyone answered that either a score of 1 through 3. So it means 0 knowledge to somewhere in the middle. And that's fine. So hopefully you'll get even more out of this presentation as we go through the challenges as such. So what I will do is I will identify what the challenges are and provide a couple of examples that you'll see in the slides. And then my colleague, Rick Lynn, who's the Solutions Architect Manager for our team, will go ahead then and expand upon what the solutions would be for those challenges. So the first one we call messy speech, for lack of a better technical term. This involves situations where you have what's called code switching. Code switching is basically someone who's bilingual, and they'll use both languages in recording and such. And with so many people in the world today that are bilingual or trilingual, it's not uncommon to have a code switching situation. Of course, if you're thinking about recording and transcribing that can be a challenge in and of itself. Also, slang, which I think is quite obvious, that depending on who you are or where you are in the world, even for the same language regionally, you'll have different slangs that you use, of course, and that's also has to be understood by the person that's recording and transcribing. And incomplete sentences. So many of us talk in phrases, either because we get interrupted by someone else, or we just simply don't need to have a complete sentence like we did in English class. So you'll just answer right to the point with whatever words would be pertinent to answer a question. And finally, filler words. So that can be like, like, and so on. And of course, just listening to everyday speech, you hear many people using these filler words. So let me turn it over to Rick to talk about the solutions in this scenario where we, will often go to expert transcribers.
Yeah, and I expect that some of our friends here that are in the room with us, that especially those of us that are in the localization world, are probably familiar with a lot of these, same issues. When it comes to transcribing and getting data transcribed for AI, there's a level of precision that, at least in my experience, that exists, that is much far beyond what was expected from say from a localization or even a regular transcription company, where the point of it always goes back to what the clients need and what the client needs are. So in local, when I've worked in, because our company also does localization, when I've worked on that side of things a little bit, their transcriptions are sometimes just, we just need the gist of it because somebody doesn't want to listen to the audio and they need to be able to understand it. So a lot of these very exact, we need exactly what they said and word for word, is sometimes the bars are set a lot lower. When we're dealing with speech technology, there has to be very strict guidelines into how we transcribe things, and the reason is because they're used to train computers to be able to understand speech. So if it's garbage in, garbage out, right? So if your transcriptions are not very accurate, then when it's learning how to understand speech, its understanding will not be very accurate as well. And as Shannon kind of touched on earlier, we've already pretty much moved beyond just like basic comprehension. Now we're dealing with scenarios where we're dealing where we want the model not only to be able to understand speech when it's spoken clearly, but even when somebody's mumbling, when somebody's switching to different languages, when somebody is starts a word or a sentence and then stops because they lost their train of thought, background noise and everything, and all of those things kind of make it harder to transcribe and harder to understand. And so, a big part of it is just to have good transcribers. I think you sometimes it requires somebody to be really familiar with the language, to be able to understand a lot of these filler words and slang and that sort of thing. And also code switching is important in the context of language code switching. If you don't know the language, you don't know what's not in the language, so that's part of it as well. But just really having kind of like those expert transcribers that are able to provide that quality and to be able to follow those instructions, because the guidelines for these types of projects are usually quite long and quite extensive, um, because they have very specific rules about when there's an incomplete word or an incomplete sentence, how do you transcribe it? And the main thing about this is that everyone needs to transcribe it consistently, because if you don't have that consistency, when the client goes to take that data to train their computers, if you're not consistent in the input, then the computer is going to get confused about what is considered an incomplete sentence and what's not considered an incomplete sentence, because part of your team is transcribing it one way and part of your team is transcribing it another way. So it's having very good transcribers that are able to have that level of attention to detail, and also having very good guidelines as well.
Thanks, Rick. So, as Rick has uh, discussed in his response, you know that the word transcription or transcribers is used repeatedly. And even though this is a presentation about speech data, um, much of the projects that we get, and Rick, I'm sure you'll agree with this, maybe perhaps the majority of them are not just simply audio recording, but they're also for transcribing, because the clients want to be able to have that digitized in text where they can maybe search on it, do frequency analysis, and so on, so that it's not simply just an audio recording. Although we have had clients that just wanted the audio and perhaps they can do their own transcribing. So, Rick, we talk about expert transcribers, but do you see this kicking up so that we have more and more need for experts in that field? Or are there some projects still today that we don't need those experts and that can just basically, strict transcription or use of, machine transcribing and so on?
I think in my experience, it depends on the client, and more we're moving over to either audio that's harder to transcribe. So you have to not only have a good understanding of the language, but also be able to listen to kind of harder to low quality audio and still be able to understand it. um, but it also depends on the client, and I'm sure Shannon would agree with this. It always goes back to the client needs. So for a company or a client that runs a company that maybe they're a little bit earlier on in their development, maybe they just need something that understands English, and so the the speech that they're dealing with is very um, very clear, and it's not very complex, and also like what they need to collect is not very complex, and so in that case there is still room for that. But certainly more and more, eventually that will be just the norm, and everyone will be on to bigger and better things, which is more of the complex things. And to be able to, yeah, I mean, one of the things, especially with code switching, for example, is before, um, when someone switched to another language, it was kind of expected that, oh, it just ends up as gibberish. but now certainly people are companies and developers out there are really trying to get it to be, what's the next step? Well, the next step is when you switch language, it will understand which language you're switched to, transcribe it in that language, and then switch back when you go back to whatever language you're
Mhm.
initially starting out with. And I also just wanted to quickly touch base with everyone here, because I realized that we might have skipped a little bit about how this technology is used, and why you need transcription. And so, in when you're developing, say, like a microwave to be able to understand your voice, it's not just the reason why you have to, or to be able to understand this, it's not just you need to record people's voices. You need to kind of provide the machine what those voices are saying, because that's how the machine kind of learns. Is it takes the audio, and then it analyzes the audio, breaks it down into just bits and bytes, and then it finds whatever patterns it finds, and then it matches that pattern to some text that you give it. So you it's kind of like teaching a child with flashcards. It's like, this piece of audio should produce this piece of text. And so that's why we're doing this. So if anyone has needs further explanation of that, feel free to add that to the Q&A questions later on, and I'd be happy to explain it in more detail. But basically, that is the general gist of why you need to have transcription, and also why you need to have consistent transcription, and why you care to tag all these things like code switching and slang, and all these things.
Great. Thanks, Rick. So what I heard from you, which is very important, is to have consistency in the transcription work. So making sure the transcribers are doing it the same way so you get uniform results. And also both you and Shannon had mentioned having more of a need for background noises and such, which are not the typical in studio type where you're recording something and you have all the controls on that. Because in the real world, many of the devices that look at the speech, and they do some sort of automation to then provide a response, it's not always very clear and clean and noiseless. We live in a noisy world, so to speak. So thanks on that. So let's look at the next challenge, which involves accents and demographics. So here, the challenge is having client requirements that aren't always easily identifiable. By that, we mean there may be some very specific, very focused groups that a client wants to record their speech for a variety of reasons. And some examples would be such as non-native accents or demographics that may involve children or elderly people. Getting that variety of speech patterns across different demographics. Also, one that we've come up, against was the speech impediments. So speech impediments has, I think, grown a little bit in need, popularity, to be more inclusive of getting speech recordings. And so that's something that, as I said, we've seen more recently. So Rick, did you want to comment on this one?
Um, yeah, and again, this kind of goes back to the client needs, and as they evolve now, instead of just being able to understand clearly spoken whatever language, say English or Japanese or whatever language, especially in North America, where um, there is a lot of accents, and it's, as they say, a melting pot of cultures and all that. um, there is definitely, you want to make sure that whatever technology that you're developing is is able to understand, say, like, for example, my mom has a very thick Chinese accent, and we want, people would want to make sure that she would also be able to kind of be able to speak to the Google Home. And I think one of the things about this that makes it more difficult, as Brian kind of touched on, is whereas before, if you're just looking for a specific language, you can target kind of like countries. Whereas if you're trying to say, how do you collect people that speak English with a Spanish accent or with a Chinese accent, for example, or even just various different types of American accents. That's the other thing too. I mean, somebody from the West Coast may speak differently from from the East Coast, and then certainly, if you're from the South, you may have different, slightly different accents, and possibly even different vocabulary to an extent. And so, if it's tied to a location, certainly that kind of does make it a little bit easier to target those locations. But when you're dealing with accents that aren't tied to a specific location, then you kind of just have to be creative. Um, you One thing to kind of look for is just, what are things that correlate with that language, and kind of target that. Um, and also the other thing is to never lose sight of what the client is actually looking for. So really kind of going to the client and asking them not only what they're looking for, but why they're looking for it, because there may be other ways to kind of collect that data. Sometimes a client might come to us and ask specifically, oh, we want English speakers in Hong Kong, for example. And when you after you speak with them, you realize that what they really want is just British English speakers that have a Chinese accent. In which case, then you realize that you can also it opens up other places. So you don't need to necessarily restrict the recruitment to Hong Kong, but you could also look at the UK, and so being clear with the client about what it is that they're looking for uh, may either open up possibilities for to make the project a lot easier to execute because you have a bit larger pool of people to recruit from. But there are also times when it could shrink it too, in terms of uh, maybe after talking to the client realizes that they have to have more strict requirements. But really, it's about finding the people, and then also qualifying them. So there, especially when you're doing kind of more remote collection and just collection that's done online, you want to make sure that you deliver high quality data to the client, and part of that means that somebody may have to listen to the audio to make sure that that person has that accent verified, because um, not everybody, for example, I'm Chinese, but I don't necessarily have a thick Chinese accent. So if you're just looking at my profile about where my ethnicity and where I'm located, that might make that might lead you to believe I have an accent that I don't actually have. Also, if I grew up in the southern U.S., I might have a southern U.S. accent too. So at some point, you have to kind of do that qualification before collecting.
So you made some good points here, Rick. One being it's an educational process many times with the client because they're looking for something that may exist or not exist, or if it even does exist, that it may not be to the degree or the volume of participants that they're asking for. So those kind of projects tend to be more challenging. I know we had one project where that happened, where they were looking for a specific region of the world with a specific accent and making sure they get those numbers. The other thing too, you mentioned, which is important, is that with the world we live in today, many people relocate over time. So you have to be very specific. You're saying you want a native speaker of that area. It's got to be someone most likely that has been born and raised there or moved there at a very young age, so that they're not bringing in a blend of an accent, for example, where they, are from one region of the world, but they speak, more like somebody from other regions. So I think both of those are important things to do. But certainly there's an educational process, and takes sometimes trial and error to figure out, if the client wants particular volume from given regions and so on, and various demographics, that you really have to go out there and figure out, is this something that's feasible, or perhaps maybe you can start off with a certain number of participants that fill up each of the demographics, and if there aren't any that you can find a particular demographic, then obviously you got to advise the client of that and see if there's some way that they can modify the project request. Okay, let's look at our next one, which is speech data at scale. This is probably the most challenging kind of speech collection project where, many companies can say, yeah, we can do a pilot, got it down pat, we got your 20 speech participants, but then they say, great, now we want to add a lot more languages, and we also want a large volume, and we want it every month. So, what do you do in that kind of situation? So there could be, monthly quotas or quarterly quotas that a particular client wants to have. And so you got to keep repeating this process, which goes back to the point about having consistency in transcribers and also expert transcribers. So you're not swapping in and out a lot of different transcribers where then it could affect the results. So definitely you want to be able to make sure that if you can commit to doing, say, a pilot, and that the client wants to be able to gear this up. Not always do they know up front, but maybe during the course of the pilot that you're working on, or even at the very beginning, they said, we need this many. And so you got to do the numbers and figure out, is this something that can be done? So Rick, let me turn it over to you to talk about the what we call the 4 Ps.
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with projects that you want to scale, I mean, as I'm sure this is probably the same sort of thing, and even in in other industries, and certainly in localization, is just to really have a very clear the 4 Ps of process, people, platform, and privacy, just to ensure that everyone kind of knows what's happening at all times. And it's all about just kind of when you're dealing with scale, you're dealing with efficiency. Um, because certainly when you have a smaller scale thing, to save a second here and there might not make of a difference. But when you're dealing with larger scale, you save a second here, you save a second there. It's the cumulative effects of that are quite big, and it can mean the difference of between being competitive in the market and not. Um, and certainly, that really certainly applies to process in terms of making sure that you have your workflows in there, especially if you're delivering good quality. You want to make sure that you have your quality assurance and QA workflows kind of set up and easily understood. And so you're able to move data from one location to the other, get it in front of the right people, which is, I guess, the next part, and to make sure that the data gets processed by the correct people, and that you build your team around the needs of the project, and everyone kind of is good at what they do and also knows what they should be doing. Certainly, of course, there's usually the need for a project manager, and depending on how technical the project is, it's usually good to have somebody that is technical on the project to be able to ensure that the data is, the integrity is there. um, the other thing is also platform. So platform, I kind of consider it kind of the tools that you use. There's certainly a lot of tools out there that are readily available. Either they're open source or they come as as a service from another company, and those platforms are good, and you want to just find the ones that work for your team. um, and so some factors that kind of go into it would be like cost, ease of use, and if you need a certain level of customizability. In terms of kind of relating it back to the process and people, um, a lot of these platforms are very good on their own, and they do well on their own, and they have great workflows built into it. And depending on your internal team's needs, sometimes you need to connect it with other tools and to connect it to other things to ensure that you have a complete package. So it's hard for me to necessarily give any blanket answers for that, because it is very kind of specific to each case and also specific to each project, in some cases as well. And something just to always be mindful of is privacy. So I mean, when we collect data, we're very explicit about why we're doing it. So, I mean, that's one of the good things comparing us to, say, other companies that are actually just collecting data as part of their service, and then that's can be kind of a bit shady. But when we're collecting data, we're pretty explicit about it because we're actually that's why people are there. So, but yeah, and then just keeping track of that data so that it doesn't get lost. That's kind of what we do.
Thanks for your thoughts on that, Rick. So I wanted to go back to your comment of the platform, having a platform. I think a lot of companies may not realize what the investment is to put forth your own platform. So if you're creating your own in-house platform, yes, you will have better control of that platform and how you customize it. But also, too, there could be a very heavy investment in there. I've seen myself in a couple of companies from the past where it was underestimated the cost of building such a platform. And of course, then if you're building it, you have to maintain it, especially if it's been highly customized. And so you always have to remember there's a certain level of investment that you have to account for, above and beyond the projects that you're working on. But of course, having the control is definitely an advantage if it's your own platform. And if you have clients like we do that are looking for customized UI or user experience or both, that you're able to do that if it's your own platform, maybe to some degree if it's the third party, but oftentimes you just have much better control when it's your own platform. And then going back to comments about the people, nowadays there are so many ways to recruit, especially when you have speech data at scale. Be it through social media, it could be through other kinds of services that specialize in freelance recruitment, um, and even forums that you can go out to and target the skills and demographics that you need for a given project. Okay, let's turn it over to um, our last challenge. And by the way, the one here on the previous page just shows what a scaled data collection workflow would be. And so, it's a typical getting the requirements and making sure that you understand them, and then creating the tasks, the recruitments, which we just talked about, the task completion. There's always a Q&A process that may have to go back through until you fully complete the task. And then obviously the processing part, file exports and so on, and then the ultimate delivery at the end. Okay, so we'll quickly go through this one. This is our last challenge, which deals with off-the-shelf versus collected data. And here, developers want that cost savings for training their data, and or whatever devices they're using for speech recognition. But then again, they may also have very niche requirements. So oftentimes the off-the-shelf kind of data that you can provide may not be sufficient or granular enough for what clients may need. An example of this is transcribing call center recordings, which have grown in demand in recent times. So, Rick, why don't you talk to us about the pluses and minuses here, about the one size fits most data set?
Yeah, I guess the point of off-the-shelf data is just to basically you're collecting the data and you're processing it to have it ready before even like the request comes in. Uh, Certainly, a lot of the times clients will come to us and they're like, "We need this data and we need it yesterday." And if you have the off-the-shelf data, then that's something that you can kind of present to them, and that's something that they can buy from you. Um, so it's really good for the client in terms of if they just don't have the time to spend, to wait for the data to be collected. You're kind of preempting that. Of course, in my experience, it seems like every single client that's come to us have very specific, nuanced differences in what they're looking for. So, it, in trying to kind of predict that, it is impossible to predict, you know, not only what the data they want will be exactly, but also even when it's processed. For example, when you're dealing with transcription, they might different companies and different clients will want things transcribed a different way. And so when we're dealing with off the shelf type of data, if that is something that your company decides to make the investment in, it's there then it's it's not, you have to kind of do that with the understanding that you're not going to be able to transcribe it exactly the way those potential clients want it to, but you just have to kind of include as much information um, as needed. So yeah, so just kind of trying to capture as much information as you can without boiling the sea, but so that the client is able to use that information, and they can kind of, usually the clients will be able to kind of manipulate the data as themselves. But yeah, just kind of go for most and not all, because if you try to match everybody's requirements, it'll just be too much to take on.
Yeah, like you said, boiling the sea, Rick, and it can become so customized that you'll end up putting an extensive amount of labor into something, and getting that final 5% could really put it at a much higher cost. Okay, well, let's go to the Q&A portion. We've had a couple questions here.
Yeah, and just to before we go to the Q&A, I would like for Josh to show us his work, our virtual artist, because it's really small right now, but he can share his screen.
Okay.
So maybe Brian, you can unshare your screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. So yeah, I know everybody loves to see the work of our visual artists, and so I really want us not to miss that. And we got a few questions. So one of those was, and you just talked about platforms. So what platforms are out there in the open source space that you would recommend?
So which platforms for speech data collection?
Yeah.
So yeah, I can kind of speak to that. I I guess in terms of platforms for collection, where there aren't many good ones that we've found, and that's why ended up building our own. So that was one of, so sometimes when there's nothing out there, you kind of have to build your own, especially when, I mean, this kind of relates to one of the other questions about data privacy. You Part of the reason why we built our own is just because then we're able to keep track of the data properly. When using a third party uh, software, you really have to do a proper audit of it, both in terms of its security, but also reliability, cost, and whether or not it does what you want it to do. It's so yeah. In terms of the collection portion, I personally haven't found anything that met our needs. There were some out there. I don't even remember the name of them, but they were. It takes, you probably need somebody on your team that is either a developer or has that knowledge to be able to set up those open source solutions to even test them to see if they work. So um, in that case, for other things like more processing, there's a lot more tools out there for um, in terms of, like, say if you need like a transcription platform. I don't really know any of those off the top of my head either. We're constantly kind of changing our tool stack, and for our company, we've built a lot of our tools, um, and that part of it is because we, at the time when we were deciding on not whether to build it or not, we were looking at what's out there, and there wasn't much. So we've had to build our own tools, but there are some that I can recommend, but they're more in like the visual annotation space and not so much in the speech annotation space in terms of open source stuff that I've found.
All right, great. We have another question. So how important do you think it would be to provide training in this field, I'm assuming it's speech data, for people speaking minority languages?
For this one, I don't know if it's possible to get some clarity about what is meant by training. Um, if I kind of make some assumptions here, I think it's an important thing for products to be trained in this, certainly because it does open up more markets, and also just in terms of like being a democratic society and being inclusive, I think it's important to include people, especially in the disability space, of being able to have products that are able to handle um, both accents but also speech impediments. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't really necessarily deal with is because if you have a speech impediment, things just take longer. So there's such a and that in expel in itself, when you're talking and then you suddenly stop talking, for example, if you have a stutter, and then you suddenly start talking again, it's important for our technology to be able to handle stuff like that, because for if it's only expecting regular speech, the way that speech detection works right now is basically if there's a pause, the computer will think that you're done. But when you're dealing with somebody with a speech impediment issue, like the stuttering, they might stop, but then they will start again after a certain amount of time. And if your technology is not aware of that, then that's a section of the population that just kind of gets left behind, which is never good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would also add to that, if you look at the interpretation sector, more and more I see on LinkedIn with the people I'm connected to that are interpreters, there's a greater demand for regional knowledge of, say, a minority language, as was put in the question. So I think that also goes along with what you're doing in speech data collection, that you're, as the world we live in and the client requirements expand to become more global, there does become a greater demand to be able to handle those what we are is being called minority accents.
Okay, great. So another question for a lot of the people in the localization field, it's important, I guess. How easy or hard is it for an LSP to become a data solution provider? And are there parallels in the work that might ease the path forward?
Well, I guess I can take that question, Mark. Um, I would say there are a lot of parallels. However, it's not 100% congruency between what an LSP does and what a data solutions speech collector would do. But LSPs are definitely a leg up. And this actually goes back to a presentation we gave at GALA several months ago, where LSPs have been working in global content for decades. So they have a very good and expertise knowledge in collecting global content, whether it be translation text or other types of data. In this respect, speech data. Also, LSPs have been working in the workflow management area of translations and outsourcing to freelancers and perhaps other vendors, and managing these linguistics and vendors at scale. So, and they're, have worked in this area for a long time doing, verification, editing, proofreading, and QA. So I would say that's a second reason that LSPs are at an advantage of doing this. Also, too, and very importantly, is that LSPs have worked, or should say many LSPs have worked in the machine translation area for quite some time now. Machine translation has been around for a while. Actually dates back to the late 1940s, but has been become very, very popular and almost a requirement for many companies to have. And so these LSPs have an in-depth understanding of the languages and also the uniqueness, the nuances of languages. So again, when you're collecting speech data and what Rick had talked about, you're looking for people that are expert transcribers. Definitely, this is where LSPs have one or two legs up on other types of companies. But again, that's not to say that someone that's represents an LSP can just quickly transition into speech data collection. There still has to be an understanding of how it's done, and of course noting the challenges that we presented today.
Great, thank you. I have another question here. So what do you think about Facebook recent announcement about GSLM that skips the text for training using audio only? Maybe you can explain what GSLM is. I think it's generative spoken language model, but you might
Yeah,
explain better than me.
that's something new. So I don't know if I really have much thoughts about it yet because that's something that is I've only recently heard about. So I need to kind of look into that a little bit further, and I don't want to give any false information. Uh, I think if it's unsupervised learning, which means that you don't necessarily need the transcription, then it might mean that you don't need the transcription. But I think um, I would imagine that they would still need the data collected to either train that system, just in terms of the recordings, because that even though we the thing that Facebook is building doesn't need transcriptions in with the audio, they still need the audio part. So I'd have to look into it a little bit further to see how exactly it works and fits together to see if maybe they don't need transcriptions, but they need other types, other things like maybe just verification of the model. But certainly, I think that there's still room and a need to collect that raw audio data, if nothing else.
Oh, great, thank you. So we have another question. So what are the data collection requirements for phoneme-based models?
I think um, this type that's very specific. When it comes to data collection, and you're dealing with audio data, then that a lot of the times our clients will actually come to us. There are times where we collect very sort of open speech, that's kind of unscripted data. But then there are times when clients will come to us and want very scripted data. So depending on what the client wants, we in terms of the actual collection part, they might have very specific things that they want to collect. In which case, we would collect kind of like speech collected or speech scripted data rather, where people are saying very specific things. Um, in terms of like the whole process, usually I think when you're dealing with tagging, and again, maybe this Facebook thing will make all of this obsolete, but um, when you're doing with very specific linguistic level tagging, it kind of comes back to, in that case, it really limits who we can use as transcribers. So we do have people that we've worked with in the past where um, there's very kind of like very specific types of linguistic type of tagging, either with accents or not just transcribing the word, but all the different pronunciation symbols and inflections and all that. And in those cases, it's just it's good to have somebody that's an expert on board to be able to do that. And that will, I mean, we all know that that comes with a cost, so it'll be, but you get what you pay for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're reaching the end of the session, but we have one last question, and maybe you can answer quickly. How important and time consuming is it to handle issues of data governance and data management? And does this require to have a person dedicated to this role?
I think it is very important, especially when you're
Mhm.
dealing with a collection. I mean, whether or not you have a dedicated person, I think um, that will depend on the size of your company, but certainly you need at least one person to be the champion for it. I think that's whether or not they spend all their time working on it, especially if you're a smaller company and you're not doing that much work in the area. it might not necessarily take up 100% of their time. So, but you want the person to be able to understand the technology and to have those conversations with every single piece of the process. And that's why, when you talk about the 4 Ps, privacy is in there. But in a way, privacy is has to be built into everything. It has to be built into the process. It has to be built into your platforms. It has to be built into the people. In the people, it has to be in terms of training, making sure everyone is aware of your data security privacy policies and all that sort of stuff. Part of the process is just making sure that things are sent and shared with only the people that need to be shared with. And then platforms is just to make sure that your technology has all the security things built in.
Cool.
I'm the security person for so that's why I'm able to speak to that.
Great.
So we want to thank GALA for having hosted us, and also all the people that participate in today's session. So thank you very much. We enjoyed it. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, Rick, and Shannon. And I hope we can continue this discussion in the lounge either tonight or tomorrow.
Love the artwork, by the way, on the future speech data.
Well
It
done,
is great.
Josh.
Very good.